The city sparkled beneath a soft blanket of snow that Christmas Eve, its streets aglow with twinkling lights and laughter echoing from passing couples. Inside a warm candlelit restaurant, Daniel Reed sat alone at a corner table, his perfectly tailored suit catching the golden glow of the chandeliers. He was a man used to power and control, a CEO whose calendar rarely allowed room for something as uncertain as a blind date. Yet tonight he waited. An hour had passed since she was supposed to arrive, and most men of his stature would have left long ago. But something, perhaps the faint memory of a promise he'd made to his late wife to never stop believing in kindness, kept him in that chair. He sipped his wine slowly, checking his watch, his eyes flicking to the door each time it opened, only to see another happy couple rush in from the cold. Across town, a woman named Grace hurried through the snow, clutching the small hand of her daughter, Mia, a bright-eyed 5-year-old with curls peeking from under a knitted cap. Grace's boots were worn, her coat too thin for the freezing wind, and her heart beat wildly as she realized how late she was. Her babysitter had canceled last minute, and her only option was to bring Mia along. The thought of showing up to a date like this, with no makeup, snow in her hair, and a child in tow, filled her with shame. "Mommy, are we going to see your friend?" Mia asked softly. Grace smiled through her nerves. "Maybe, sweetheart. He might not even be there anymore." Yet deep down, she hoped he was. She hadn't been on a date in years, not since her husband died in an accident that left her rebuilding her life from ashes. When the restaurant door finally swung open and Grace stepped inside, shaking off the snow, the hostess blinked at her uncertainly. Her eyes darted toward Daniel's table, the only one still occupied by a single man waiting. Grace swallowed hard, her instinct telling her to leave. But Mia tugged her hand and whispered, "He looks nice, Mommy." Gathering what little courage she had, Grace approached. Daniel looked up, and in that moment, something shifted. She wasn't what he'd expected. No glamorous dress, no perfume, no carefully practiced smile. But there was something about her tired eyes and the quiet strength in her posture that made him forget the hours he'd waited. "I'm so sorry I'm late," Grace began, her voice trembling. There were complications, and I didn't want to cancel again. This is my daughter, Mia. I hope you don't mind," Daniel interrupted softly, standing up and pulling out a chair. "You're here now. That's what matters." His tone wasn't the dismissive politeness of a rich man pretending to be kind. It was warm, genuine, almost protective. Mia climbed into her seat shyly, glancing up at the tall man who smiled at her like she was the most important person in the room. Around them, conversations continued. Waiters moved briskly, but for that small table, time seemed to pause. Dinner began awkwardly. Grace kept apologizing for Mia's chatter, for her own nervousness, for the way her phone screen was cracked when she checked the time. But Daniel found himself drawn to the honesty she carried. When Mia accidentally knocked over her juice, Grace panicked, reaching for napkins, but Daniel simply laughed and helped her clean up. "You know," he said, "I've attended 1,000 dinners that felt empty. This feels real." Grace looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the polished CEO she'd imagined, but a man who seemed quietly lonely beneath his calm exterior. By dessert, Mia had fallen asleep in Grace's lap, her small face nestled against her mother's arm. Daniel signaled for the bill, but waved off the waiter when he saw Grace fumbling for her purse. "Please," he said gently. "It's Christmas Eve. Let me." Grace hesitated, pride flickering in her chest. "I don't want charity," he smiled a little sadly. "Then let's call it a gift, not from a CEO, but from a man who's grateful you showed up." For the first time that night, Grace smiled too, not the polite kind, but one that came from the quiet warmth spreading in her chest. Outside, the snow had thickened, blanketing the world in silence. Daniel offered to drive them home, but Grace declined at first, embarrassed by where she lived. When he insisted, she finally agreed, and as his car rolled through narrow streets lined with flickering lights, Daniel listened as Grace talked about her late husband, her struggles and her hopes for Mia's future. "You're doing more than enough," he said softly. "You're raising her with love. That's something money can't buy." When they reached her building, a modest complex on the edge of town, Daniel didn't comment on the peeling paint or the broken lamp outside. Instead, he walked them to the door and handed Mia a small red box from his pocket. Inside was a snowflake pendant, "Every strong girl deserves a little magic," he said. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she thanked him, her voice barely audible. Daniel hesitated before saying goodnight, as though leaving felt somehow wrong. "Would it be all right," he asked, "if I called you tomorrow? Maybe we could continue where we left off." Grace nodded slowly, unable to find the words. When he turned to leave, Mia stirred in her mother's arms and whispered sleepily, "Mommy, he looks like the prince from your bedtime stories." Grace smiled faintly, watching his figure fade into the snowy night, and for the first time in years, she dared to believe that maybe Christmas miracles weren't just for fairy tales. That night, Daniel sat in his car outside her building for a long time, staring at the falling snow. He'd come expecting a typical date, something light, forgettable. But instead, he'd found something that unsettled and warmed him in equal measure. Grace reminded him of who he used to be, before success made him guarded. And Mia, that small, trusting face, had reminded him that love could still exist in unexpected places. As he drove home, the city's lights blurred through his windshield, but his heart felt clearer than it had in years. Over the next weeks, Daniel and Grace's paths crossed again, at a cafe, at the park where Mia played, at a charity event Daniel sponsored. Each time, the distance between them shrank, the unspoken connection deepening. Grace no longer felt like the poor single mom, and Daniel no longer felt like the lonely CEO. On the next Christmas Eve, 1 year later, they sat together again in that same restaurant, no longer strangers waiting for a miracle, but a family that had found one. And when Mia laughed, her tiny snowflake pendant glinting under the lights, Grace looked at Daniel and whispered, "Thank you for waiting that night." He took her hand and smiled. "Some things," he said softly, "are worth waiting forever for." A year had passed since that snowy night when Grace stumbled into Daniel's world, and life had quietly rewritten itself in ways neither of them had imagined possible. The restaurant where they first met had become their small tradition. Every Christmas Eve, they returned, not as strangers on an awkward blind date, but as a family who'd found love where it was least expected. Daniel sat across from Grace now, his once cold demeanor softened by laughter lines and warmth. The weight of the CEO's crown no longer made him feel untouchable. It only reminded him of the responsibility he carried, not to his company, but to the two people who'd brought meaning back to his life. Mia sat between them, excitedly unwrapping the chocolate gift Daniel had brought, her giggles filling the air like the soft jingling of Christmas bells.